In relation to the perceptions of the so-called civilized world, the attitude toward marriage, family, and love in general in ancient India is of course shocking in many ways even now, but some traditions, among other things, are also delightful. Although it should be pointed out that in ancient India a woman was originally considered to be an inferior class creature, and her human rights were fairly well protected by the laws of that time. You're watching Flip Side of History, the other side of the known world history. Now we will tell you about ancient India's traditions and customs of marriage and love, and what seems strange for us today that was generally a norm back then. Let's begin our story. Marriage preparation. Ironically, according to tradition, the bride-to-be often did not see her future husband before the wedding. Arrangements for marriage were made between the parents, and the opinion of the bride-to-be was not taken into consideration at all. Therefore, it was quite common for a girl to ask her mother whom exactly she would marry. According to the customs, girls were educated until about the age of 12, after which the search for a husband began. Sometimes the process of education ended as soon as she reached puberty. It was believed that the sooner a girl got married, the better. It was strictly forbidden not only to talk to outside men, but even to look at them. By the way, it was thought that the ideal married couple was one in which the age of the bride was 1/3 of the age of the groom. It was assumed that a girl not younger than 16 years old could give birth to a complete child, so even if there were so-called child marriages, there are almost no mentions of them in ancient literature. At last, the bride's purity in terms of virginity was considered to be the main and necessary condition for marriage. We need to say that even in modern India, a bride deprived of her innocence before marriage in certain cases might never marry at all. Attitude toward love and family. Although some people are amazed at how they can live with a man they have never seen or even heard of before marriage, this was not the case in ancient India. It was believed that marriage was a duty and a woman could not help but love her husband. Precisely because she is a wife, she must love. Or, as one Indian historian said, love reveals itself. A wife cannot help but love her husband. She loves him because he's her husband. You fall in love before marriage. We fall in love after marriage. The only difference is that after you get married, your passion quickly fades and you easily get divorced. With us, it doesn't happen. And possibly most remarkably, women in ancient India were virtually forbidden to work. The husband had to provide for the family, and the woman had the responsibility for the home, children, and household. Moreover, a woman who worked was considered simply a disgrace to her husband. A girl means a problem. This was characteristic for not only ancient India but for other ancient kingdoms as well. However, it was in India that it was very pronounced. Any bride had to marry only with a dowry. So often in poor families, the marriage of a daughter meant that the head of the family would remain in debt for the rest of his lifetime. And in an effort to preserve their status in society, not to have an unmarried daughter, which was embarrassing, poor people quite often entered into really gruesome marriages, giving their daughters away to minors, the mentally insane and deviant, the sick with leprosy and other people with certain, let's say, defects, to say the least, members of society. This, however, often resulted in the unfortunate brides simply ending their lives by suicide. Checking the suitability for marriage. In ancient India, they were more than meticulous with regard to this. Naturally, marriages between representatives of different castes were strictly forbidden. Even in modern India, despite numerous indulgences, often a girl from a lower caste could not marry young men from a higher caste, or vice versa. In addition to this, the ancient Indians were very careful to check the lineage of the newlyweds. Well, unlike in Europe, where marriages even between close relatives time to time were practiced, in India this was excluded. If it turned out that the future bride and groom had a common relative in the 7th generation from the father's side, or in the 5th generation from the mother's side, the decision to marry was abandoned. How many marriages in ancient India? In truth, the question of the family in ancient India, as already mentioned, was dealt with very carefully. Therefore, there were even categories of marriages that could be conditionally classified as marriages of the highest Vedic form, and inferior marriages that were worthy only of acceptance, and that through grinding one's teeth. The first major marriages in which children were blessed from birth with knowledge of the Vedas were Brahma, The bride marries a member of her caste with dowry in all the ceremonies. Daiva, the girl is given in marriage to the priest as offering thanks to the sacrifice performed. Arsha, surprisingly in this case the bride is married without dowry and the groom pays a symbolic dowry for her. Prajapatya, the bride enters the house of her husband without dowry and payment. About these four main types of marriage, it is said this way. In families that have arisen from the four forms of marriage, sons are born who shine with the knowledge of the Vedas, approved by scholars. The following four types of marriage were not essentially the marriages except the second, Gandharva, consensual marriage without ceremonies, often simply based on a purely verbal agreement. Asura, the bride is bought out. Rakshasa, the bride is stolen. And Paishacha, deprivation of innocence of a drunken, unconscious, insane girl, etc. Polygamy, polyandry, and divorce. Although generally divorce was excluded for women and a woman who ran away from the family was punished with a fine, there were also some deviations from the generally accepted rules. For instance, if the marriage was concluded without all the ceremonies, it was possible to divorce simply on the basis of a verbal agreement. By the way, a woman could leave the family on her own if she could prove that she had been mistreated. As for polygamy, exactly the man had all the rights, naturally on the condition that he treat all wives equally. It was allowed to have another wife in his house if the first wife was infertile or if she gave birth only to girls. A man also had the right simply to marry another woman without expelling the former one. The most fascinating thing is that in ancient India there was also the inverse of polygamy, the marriage of several men to one woman. There are mentions in manuscripts of the entire male family marrying one girl. This was most likely due to poverty and an extreme shortage of women. The status of a woman in the family. Although a woman had sufficient rights, in ancient India she was disempowered in some respects. On the one hand, a woman had the legal right to cheat on her husband if he went away for a long time, without leaving enough money to survive. On the other hand, a man, as the owner of his wife, could sell her, even with the children, although this was not encouraged, or force her to be intimate with another man. And refusal was considered a violation of the law and disobedience. For all fairness' sake, it must be said that in ancient India, despite all allowances and restrictions, a man was obliged to take care of his wife, to protect her, and to avoid any kind of violence. The only exception was the situation of widows. Widows had no right to remarry, and remarriage, if it happened by some miracle, was simply a salvation for the woman. The fact is that in ancient India, a widow was considered not just a simple outcast, but a family burden. And if in the higher castes this kind of question was somehow balanced, in the lower castes, where there was a constant struggle for existence, there was no time for ceremonies. A widow had to lead a very rigid and ascetic life. Widows had the right to sleep only on the bare ground, to eat once a day, and only coarse food. Moreover, the woman was deprived of the ability to wear any colorful clothing, to shave her head naked, and to spend her days in prayer and memorial rites for her deceased husband, whom the inconsolable woman would meet in another life. In addition, in ancient India it was believed that the appearance of a widow anywhere was a bad premonition. The only exception was children. The unhappy widow, therefore, had to be locked up most of the time so that the mere presence would not bring misfortune upon all who came near. Hence, the most optimal way out for an unhappy woman was the rite of sati, ascending the funeral pyre together with her deceased husband. A torturous death was still shorter and happier perhaps than decades of the most miserable existence in an atmosphere of constant tracking so as not to anger the spirit of the deceased. Prohibitions: widows were not even allowed to eat, for example honey, and almost complete isolation. Who would want to talk to the forerunner of misfortune? That is it for today. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Flip Side of History and leave a like.